The night was cold enough to bite through skin, but Mara didn't feel it. Fear burned hotter than frost ever could. Her feet pounded the hard-packed dirt road, bleeding and bare, as she stumbled through the darkness. The prairie stretched endlessly on either side, black land under a blacker sky, and still she ran, gasping, praying the sound of hooves behind her was only in her imagination. She didn't know how long she'd been running. Maybe hours. Maybe a lifetime. Her torn shawl clung to her shoulders, and her breath came in shallow, painful bursts. Every time she slowed, she saw his face again, the man who bought her from her stepfather like she was a mule. He had promised her safety, but what he wanted was obedience. When his hands turned cruel, she broke free and fled into the night, leaving everything behind but her terror. By dawn, her body gave out. She collapsed on a patch of earth just beyond a barbed wire fence. The faint outline of a house stood in the distance, a lonely ranch house with smoke curling from its chimney. Somewhere beyond that, a windmill creaked in the early light. Mara lay still, clutching her stomach, whispering to herself, "Don't go back. Don't let him find you." A shadow fell over her. Boots crunched on gravel. For a moment, she thought it was the man who'd come to take her back, and panic tore through her chest. She scrambled backward, eyes wild, but the man standing there wasn't dressed in city clothes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-worn hat pulled low over his brow, and a long duster coat that flapped against his legs. His face was rough with stubble, his eyes steady and unreadable, eyes that had seen too much. He didn't speak right away. Just crouched beside her, studying the bruises on her wrists, the dirt on her cheeks, the fear in her eyes. Mara tried to push herself up, tried to run again, but her legs gave out. "Please," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Don't hurt me. I can work. I'll work for food, The words tumbled out like a plea she'd said too many times before. The cowboy didn't move closer. He just straightened slowly, removed his hat, and after a long silence said in a low, rough voice, "You're safe. Come home." 4 simple words, but they hit her harder than any blow. She stared at him, trembling, unsure if she'd heard right. He offered her his hand, not to take, but to let her choose. Hesitant, she placed her shaking fingers in his. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and draped his coat around her shoulders. The warmth of it was startling. He didn't ask her name or where she came from. He didn't ask what she'd done or who she'd run from. He just led her down the dirt path toward the house. As they walked, Mara noticed how quiet it was. No voices, no laughter, just the wind moving through the grass and the faint creak of a barn door swinging open. The place felt empty, like it carried old grief. When they reached the porch, he opened the door and nodded her inside. "Sit by the fire," he said simply, and then turned away to fetch water from the pump. Mara sank onto the wooden chair, staring into the flickering flames. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but slowly warmth seeped through her bones. For the first time in years, no one shouted orders at her. No one threatened her. She didn't know who this man was or why he'd helped her, but something in his voice, in that quiet promise of safety, made her believe him. Outside, the wind howled across the open land. Inside, Mara sat wrapped in a stranger's coat, whispering to herself, almost disbelieving, "Safe. He said I'm safe." It was the first time those words had ever felt true. The man who found Mara was named Eli Carter, though most in town called him the Quiet One from the Ridge. He was a man of few words, but his silence wasn't born of arrogance. It came from loss. 5 years ago, his wife, Clara, and their newborn son had died during a harsh winter. Since then, Eli had spoken only when necessary, living alone on the wide stretch of land his father left him. The Carter Ranch had once been a place of laughter, music, and Sunday suppers. Now it was a house of ghosts and chores, livestock to feed, fences to mend, graves to visit. That morning, when he saw the girl at his gate, something in him shifted. She looked like a wild thing, thin, trembling, eyes darting like a frightened animal. There was a bruise on her cheek, fresh and dark, and dirt streaked down her neck like shadows. He could have turned away. He'd told himself for years that people brought trouble. But when she whispered, "Please don't hurt me, I can work," it cut through his armor like a blade. Eli wasn't a man of comforting words. He didn't know how to promise safety or healing. So he said the only truth that came to him, steady and low. "You're safe. Come home." He saw the disbelief in her eyes, saw her hesitate before taking his hand. That small act, her trust, fragile and trembling, felt heavier than any load of hay he'd ever carried. He brought her to the house quietly, letting her walk ahead so she wouldn't feel trapped. Inside, the fire was barely alive in the hearth, but he stirred it back to life. The old dog, Scout, lifted his head from the corner and gave a cautious sniff before settling back down. Eli poured water into a tin basin and set it near the fire. "Wash up," he said softly. Then, without waiting for thanks or questions, he went to the kitchen. He cracked a couple of eggs into a pan, sliced bread, and poured coffee. He didn't look at her as he worked. It seemed to make her more at ease. When he finally turned, she was standing by the fire, clutching his coat tight around her shoulders. Her face still pale, but her eyes clearer. "Sit," he said simply, setting a plate on the table. Mara hesitated. She looked at the food as if it might be a trick. When he didn't move closer or speak again, she finally sat and began to eat, carefully, silently, almost apologetically. Eli leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, watching the rain start to fall outside. When she'd finished, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once. "You can stay a while, till you're ready." Her hands tightened around the cup she held. "You don't even know my name." "No," he said, "but I know what fear looks like." That was the end of it. No questions. No demands. Later that day, she offered to work, sweep floors, wash dishes, anything. Eli didn't stop her. Work, he knew, sometimes kept the mind from falling apart. He went about his chores, too, fixing a broken gate and feeding the horses. From the barn window, he saw her hanging laundry in the breeze, her hair coming loose, her movements slow but steady. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Eli found himself sitting by the porch with his dog at his feet, listening to the faint hum of her voice from inside the kitchen. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it softened something in him that had been frozen for years. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel so empty. He didn't know who she was, or what had driven her to his land. But he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let the world break her again, not while she was under his roof. Mara awoke to the soft crackle of the fireplace and the faint smell of bread baking. Morning sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, catching dust motes in its glow. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was small but clean, a patchwork quilt over her, a worn Bible on the nightstand, and a chair with folded clothes on it. Not a cage, not a cell, a real room. Then memory struck. The road, the man, the words he'd said, "You're safe. Come home." Her breath hitched. Could she believe that? Could she truly be safe? She swung her legs out of bed, wincing as her soles met the cold floorboards. Her body ached, but it was a quiet ache, the kind that meant she'd survived. She dressed in the old flannel shirt and skirt someone had left out for her and stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, except for the steady rhythm of boots on the porch outside. Eli was out front, splitting wood. His movements were slow, deliberate, each strike precise. He didn't look up when she appeared at the door, though she knew he'd sensed her. His dog, Scout, lifted his head and wagged his tail once before settling again. Mara cleared her throat. "You didn't have to give me clothes." Eli set the axe aside. "Didn't fit me," he said dryly. A small startled laugh escaped her, soft and fleeting like a bird's flutter. She wasn't sure when she'd last laughed. He nodded toward the kitchen. "Food's on the stove. Eat before it gets cold." Inside, she found half a loaf of bread, a pot of stew, and a note scrawled in a blunt hand. "Back by noon. Don't wander far." She ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling warmth spread through her chest that wasn't just from the fire. After eating, she began to tidy up the kitchen. It felt strange to move freely without fear of reprimand. She washed dishes, swept the floor, and even hummed a tune her mother used to sing. But when she went to fetch more firewood from the hall, her hand brushed a half-open door. Curiosity drew her in. The room beyond was different from the rest of the house, still and untouched. A faint layer of dust covered everything, but she could see what it had been, a nursery. A small wooden crib stood against the far wall, a rocking chair by the window, and a faded quilt folded neatly on a chest. The air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. Mara stepped closer and brushed her fingers over the crib's edge. A small carved name was etched into the wood. Luke. Before she could turn away, she heard the floorboard creak behind her. Eli stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, stopping her. "You didn't know." Silence filled the space, deep and painful. He stepped past her and straightened the little blanket on the crib. "He was 2 months old," Eli said quietly. "Winter took him. Took his mama, too." Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, still looking at the crib. "I don't open this room much." His voice was rough, but not angry. "But I don't mind if you need a quiet place to sit." Mara blinked back tears. She wanted to tell him she understood loss, that she too had buried pieces of herself to survive, but the words stuck in her throat. So she just nodded and left him there, his shadow long in the morning light. That night, when she passed the nursery again, the door was slightly open, and a candle flickered inside. She paused, realizing he'd left it that way, not to ward off ghosts, but maybe to make space for her in a house that had long forgotten warmth. And for the first time since running, Mara didn't feel like a burden. She felt seen. By the end of her first week at Carter Ranch, Mara had begun to breathe differently. The air still carried the chill of early spring, but the constant tension in her shoulders had eased a little. She rose before dawn, lit the fire, and cooked breakfast while Eli worked the fences. He never ordered her about, never questioned her past, only nodded his quiet approval when she took up chores of her own choosing. It was the first time she'd lived without fear dictating her every move. But the world beyond the ranch wasn't as kind. The nearest town, Maple Ridge, was small, just one long street lined with a general store, a church, a saloon, and a handful of houses. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's stories, and invented the ones they didn't. When Eli Carter rode in on Saturday for supplies, leading a wagon with a woman sitting beside him, heads turned before the dust even settled. Old Mrs. Boone, who ran the general store, squinted through her spectacles as Eli helped Mara down. "Well, I'll be," she muttered to herself. "Didn't think I'd see the day Eli brought company." Inside, as Mara helped gather flour and sugar, Mrs. Boone's questions came dressed as kindness. "You staying out at Eli's place, dear? Mighty quiet out there for a young thing like you. Folks'll start to wonder if you're his new housekeeper, or something else." Mara flushed, gripping the paper bag too tight. "Just helping him with chores, ma'am?" Mrs. Boone smiled in that way that wasn't really a smile. Of course. You're lucky, though. Most women don't get second chances out here. Make sure you mind your manners. Eli's got a reputation to keep." Eli appeared just then, expression unreadable. He placed coins on the counter and said only, "That all?" Mrs. Boone opened her mouth to pry further, but Eli tipped his hat, guided Mara outside, and loaded the wagon without another word. As they rode home, Mara kept her eyes on the road. "I didn't mean to make trouble," she said quietly. Eli glanced at her once, then back to the horizon. "Town talks. Always has. Let it, but they think they can think what they want," he interrupted gently. "You don't owe them anything." His voice carried the kind of certainty that made her throat tighten. For years, every man she'd known had measured her worth in obedience or silence. But Eli's calm dismissal of the town's cruelty felt like a shield she hadn't known she needed. That night, as she folded laundry by the fire, she replayed the words in her head. Let them talk. It sounded easy when he said it. Yet she couldn't help feeling the sting of those whispers. She'd spent her life trying to stay invisible. Now even her presence was enough to spark gossip. Days passed, and the rumors grew like weeds. The blacksmith's wife told the preacher that Eli had taken in a stray. The saloon keeper joked that he'd finally found himself a warm bed for the winter. Each lie twisted, its way back to Mara through glances and snide smiles when she accompanied Eli to town again. Once, when she lingered outside the store, she overheard two men laughing near the water trough. "She's a pretty little thing," one said. "You think he's keeping her for more than chores?" The other spat into the dirt. "Man like Eli don't bring home strays for nothing." Mara froze, shame burning through her chest. She wanted to run back to the ranch and never show her face again. That evening, Eli found her sitting on the porch steps, knees drawn up, eyes red. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. He sat beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. The silence between them stretched until the stars began to appear. "They're saying things," she whispered. "I know. I didn't mean to." "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, his tone steady as the land around them. "People like to fill silence with noise. Let them talk until they tire themselves out." Mara turned her face toward him. "And you? What do you think of me?" Eli looked at her then, really looked. At the bruises fading from her skin, at the fear still clinging to her like a shadow, and at the quiet strength returning to her eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "you've been through enough talk for a lifetime. You don't need mine, too." For the first time in years, she felt seen not for what she'd escaped, but for who she was becoming. And though the town whispered, the ranch stayed quiet, its silence not of judgment, but of peace. The days began to fall into rhythm, quiet, predictable, almost peaceful. Mara rose before the sun, lit the stove, and fetched water from the well. Eli was always up before her, already outside tending to the horses or mending the east fence. Their conversations were brief, their silences long. But somehow, those silences spoke more than words ever could. At first, she was careful around him, moving softly, speaking only when spoken to. She still startled at sudden sounds, the slam of a door, a dog's bark, the thunder of hooves. But Eli never pressed her, never asked questions that would corner her into pain. He simply gave her time and space, as if he understood that healing wasn't something to be rushed. One morning, while she swept the porch, she noticed him watching her from the paddock. He wasn't staring, not in the way men had before. There was no hunger, no curiosity, just quiet awareness. When she looked up, their eyes met for the briefest second before he turned back to his work. Yet that single glance lingered in her chest for hours, warm and steady. It was Scout, Eli's old dog, who became her first real companion. The gray-muzzled shepherd followed her everywhere, into the garden, around the chicken coop, even to the creek where she washed clothes. When she talked to him, Eli would sometimes glance up from a distance, that faint, almost invisible curve at the corner of his mouth betraying a hint of amusement. One evening, a storm rolled in from the north. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. The sound of thunder cracked open something deep inside Mara, an old memory, a man shouting, a door slamming, the sharp edge of fear. She dropped the plate she was drying, hands trembling. Eli came in from the porch at the sound. "You all right?" Her breath hitched. I just... The noise. Without another word, he crouched down and gathered the shattered pieces of the plate, his movements calm and unhurried. "Happens to everyone," he said simply, as if to spare her the embarrassment. When lightning flashed again, she flinched. He looked toward the window, then back at her. "Come on," he said softly. "Fire's better in the other room." She followed him to the sitting room where he stirred the flames higher. She sat on the floor, drawing her knees close, trembling despite the heat. Eli took his chair by the hearth, silent as ever. Scout padded over and lay across Mara's feet, anchoring her to something solid and safe. Minutes passed. The storm raged outside, but inside there was only the crackle of the fire. When the thunder rolled again, she buried her face in her hands. "I hate being afraid," she whispered. Eli's voice came low and steady. "Being afraid just means you remember." She lifted her head. "You don't sound afraid of anything." He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I've had my share," he said finally. "You just learned to live beside it." His words sank deep. They didn't erase the fear, but they made her feel less alone in it. The storm lasted through the night. At some point, Mara must have fallen asleep on the rug, Scout still curled beside her. When she woke at dawn, a blanket was draped over her shoulders. Eli was gone, out working again, no doubt, but the fire had been stoked, and her teacup sat refilled on the table. It wasn't much, but to Mara it meant everything. He hadn't spoken a single comforting word, yet somehow she felt comforted. From that night on, something subtle shifted between them. They didn't talk about it, didn't need to. When he passed her tools while she fixed the chicken coop, their fingers brushed, and neither of them looked away. When she hummed while baking bread, he listened quietly from the porch. They were two broken souls learning to exist side by side, not by speaking, but by the quiet ways people begin to trust again. And in that stillness, a bond was forming, fragile, unspoken, but real. The peace that had settled over the ranch felt almost unreal to Mara. For the first time in years, she had begun to believe that life could be quiet and gentle. The days passed in rhythm, the kind that heals without fanfare. She tended the garden, milked the cow, mended torn shirts. Eli worked from sunrise to dusk, his steady presence anchoring her to something she hadn't known she missed: stability. But peace, as she would learn, never lasted long when the past refused to die. It began with strangers in town. Eli had ridden into Maple Ridge one afternoon to sell a few calves and buy seed. When he returned, his jaw was tight, his movements clipped. Mara noticed it instantly. He didn't meet her eyes as he unhitched the wagon or led the horses to the barn. She followed him there, hesitant. "Something wrong?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. His hands were steady on the bridle, but his voice was rough when he finally spoke. "A man came asking questions." Mara froze. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't belong to honest folks." He paused, looking up at her then. "Said he was looking for a girl. Brown hair. Scar on her hand," her breath caught. The scar. She instinctively hid her hand behind her apron. He found me?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. She stumbled back a step, her throat tight. "He'll come here." "He always finds me." Eli took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Not while I'm here." The words were simple, calm, but the conviction behind them was iron. He wasn't a man of promises. Yet when he said it, she almost believed he could stop the world itself if it meant keeping her safe. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. Every sound, the wind, the rustling trees, the distant coyote, felt like footsteps creeping closer. She sat by the window staring into the darkness, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The past she'd run from felt suddenly close again, like cold breath on her neck. Before dawn, she found Eli saddling his horse. His rifle hung from the saddle, and his expression was set in stone. "You're leaving?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Just riding to the edge of the property," he said. "If he's out there, I'll know." She shook her head, tears forming. "You don't have to protect me. He's dangerous." Eli tightened the strap on the saddle and turned to face her fully. "You think I don't know danger? Let him come." It was the first time she'd seen something fierce behind his quiet eyes, a fire that both frightened and comforted her. Hours later he returned, dust coating his coat and hat. He said little, only that the man had been in town showing papers, claims that she was property, that she'd run from her employer owing him money. The sheriff, bound by law more than conscience, had promised to look into it. Mara's world tilted. "He'll take me," she whispered. "The law's on his side." Eli looked at her for a long moment, then said evenly, "Law don't make something right." The next day, he told her to pack a few things, only what she could carry. "We'll ride out before dawn," he said. "There's a place across the canyon, old Miller's cabin. No one'll think to look there." Mara hesitated. "You'd leave your home for me?" Eli's jaw tightened. "A home's just wood and dirt. You—" He stopped himself, looked away, and simply said, "You matter more." Before sunrise, the two rode out under a sky still bruised from night. The wind carried the scent of rain, and thunder rumbled in the distance. As the first drops fell, Mara glanced back at the ranch disappearing behind them. For the first time since she'd fled that terrible house, she wasn't running alone. Eli's coat was heavy around her shoulders, his words steady through the storm. "You're not property, and you're not alone anymore." The sky was a bruise of gray and violet as Eli and Mara rode out from Carter Ranch. The wind had a sharp electric bite, the kind that carried the scent of rain and warning. Behind them, the land stretched endlessly, open and exposed. Ahead lay the canyon trail, narrow and winding, leading toward the abandoned Miller cabin Eli had mentioned. Mara clung to the saddle horn, her fingers aching from the cold. She wasn't used to riding, and the storm made the horse's movements uneven. But she didn't complain, didn't ask how far. She trusted him now, trusted the man whose few words had come to mean everything. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low growl of thunder. "We'll make it before the worst of it," Eli said, raising his voice above the wind. But the storm had other plans. By the time they reached the ridge, the sky split open. Rain poured down in torrents, soaking them through within minutes. The dirt road turned to mud beneath the horse's hooves, slick and treacherous. Mara's shawl clung to her like a second skin, and her hair plastered to her face. The thunder cracked again, louder this time, so close it made her flinch. Eli felt her tense behind him and glanced over his shoulder. "We'll stop ahead," he called out. Old barn near the creek. When they reached it, a leaning, half-collapsed structure barely standing against the wind, he helped her down, steadying her trembling hands. She stumbled, her boots sinking in the mud, but he caught her before she fell. For a brief moment, lightning illuminated his face, rain dripping from his hat, jaw tight, eyes fierce with determination. Inside, the barn smelled of wet hay and dust. Eli guided her toward a dry corner, spread his coat over a stack of burlap sacks, and got a small fire going using dry twigs from a crate. The warmth was faint, but enough to stop their shivering. Mara sat close to the fire, arms wrapped around her knees. The flickering light painted her face in gold and shadow. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Only the rain spoke for them, hammering against the roof like impatient fists. Finally, she broke the silence. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bring you into my mess." Eli's response was quiet, almost lost in the rain. "You didn't bring trouble." "Trouble found you," she shook her head, tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. "You don't know what he's capable of. He'll come after you, too." Eli leaned back against the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. "Let him come," he said. His tone wasn't boastful, just steady, certain. "I've lost worse things than a fight." His calmness both comforted and unnerved her. She looked at him through the flicker of the flames, at the hard lines of his face softened by the light. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. Thunder rolled again, distant now. "Because someone should have done it sooner," he said at last. The words struck something deep inside her, a kind of ache that had nothing to do with fear. No one had ever stood between her and danger before. No one had looked at her without wanting something in return. She turned away, hiding her tears in the crook of her arm. Eli said nothing, just tossed another log onto the fire and kept watch through the gap in the boards. Hours passed. The storm began to quiet, the steady drumming of rain softening into a whisper. Mara's head grew heavy with exhaustion. She lay down on the burlap sacks, close enough to the fire's warmth, but far enough to give him space. Before her eyes closed, she murmured, "Thank you for not asking." Eli glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Ain't my right to," he said softly. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle patter. Inside the old barn, two weary souls, one running from her past, the other from his grief, found a fragile peace in the middle of the storm, and though neither dared say it aloud, both knew the danger wasn't over. The storm outside had passed, but the real one was still coming. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and shining. Mist clung to the grass and rose from the creek like breath. Eli stepped outside the barn, squinting against the pale morning light. The world smelled of wet earth and pine, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing it in. It was the kind of quiet he'd always sought, and the kind that somehow didn't feel lonely anymore. Inside, Mara stirred beneath his coat. Her hair was tangled, her face pale from exhaustion, but when she opened her eyes and saw him by the door, something unspoken softened her features. For weeks, she'd woken in fear of footsteps and harsh voices. Now she woke to the sound of rain easing, and a man who never shouted, never touched her without asking, never demanded a thing. "You should eat," Eli said when she sat up. He handed her a piece of bread from his pack. She took it with shaking hands, murmuring her thanks. They stayed in the barn until the ground dried enough to travel. During that time, Mara began to talk, not much at first, just fragments. She told him about the farm she'd been sold to, the long nights spent working, the man's rage when she tried to run. She spoke haltingly, like someone relearning a language. Eli never interrupted. He simply listened, eyes steady on the horizon, as if her pain deserved the same quiet reverence as sunrise. When she faltered, he'd hand her water or tend to the fire, small gestures that said more than pity ever could. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked one evening, staring at the dying embers. Eli took his time answering. "Because no one helped me," he said finally. She looked up, waiting. He didn't offer more, but she understood. The sorrow that sometimes flickered in his eyes wasn't just loneliness, it was grief. She'd seen him glance toward the sky when he thought she wasn't looking, lips moving in what might have been prayer or apology. When the rain cleared, they rode back toward Carter Ranch. The land gleamed under the sunlight, the world reborn after the storm. Mara's fear lingered, but so did something new, an unfamiliar strength, quiet but growing. Back home, Eli began to repair things that had long been left untouched. He fixed the shutters, mended the broken porch rail, even cleaned out the old nursery she'd found weeks earlier. When Mara saw him sanding the wooden crib, she froze in the doorway. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. He looked up, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Maybe I do." It wasn't about the past, she realized. It was about the act itself, of choosing to live again. Watching him work, something stirred in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt since childhood. She began to plant flowers by the fence, wild prairie blooms she'd found near the creek. When Eli passed by, he paused, watching her kneel in the dirt, her hands steady and sure. "Didn't think you liked flowers much," he said. "I didn't," she replied, brushing soil from her fingers. "But I like what they mean." "And what's that?" "That something ugly can still grow into something beautiful." He looked at her for a long time before tipping his hat and walking off toward the barn. She smiled faintly, knowing he understood. Over the next weeks, laughter began to return to the house. Not loud or constant, but real. Mara hummed while she baked, and Eli sometimes caught himself whistling while working. In the evenings, they sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the hills. He'd sip his coffee, she'd mend her sewing, and the silence between them would hum with something almost tender. One night, as fireflies drifted through the yard, Mara said softly, "I don't wake up afraid anymore." Eli glanced at her, then at the horizon. "Good," he said. "Means you're starting to live again." She smiled, her heart steady in her chest. Maybe healing didn't come in grand gestures. Maybe it came in mornings spent side by side, in quiet rooms filled with new laughter, in the warmth of a shared fire after a storm. And for the first time, Mara allowed herself to believe in something she thought long gone, hope. The peace they had built was fragile, like sunlight on still water, beautiful but easily broken. For weeks, life at the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. Mara cooked, cleaned, and helped with the horses. Eli tended the fields and repaired the fences. They spoke little but understood much, their silences full rather than empty. Yet somewhere in the distance, the past was stirring, and both of them could feel it. It began with the dust trail on the horizon. Eli saw it first, 3 riders moving fast, too steady to be travelers. He didn't say anything at first, only narrowed his eyes and kept watching as the shapes grew clearer. The lead rider had a red bandana tied around his neck. Mara knew that bandana. She'd seen it every day for years, right before the lash or the shout. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's him," she whispered. Eli didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The look on her face said enough. He moved calmly, almost too calmly. "Go inside," he told her. She shook her head, trembling. "You can't face him alone. He'll kill you." He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Mara, inside." The riders approached the front gate, the pounding of hooves echoing through the open land. Eli stood on the porch, rifle in hand, posture straight and unflinching. The wind tugged at his coat. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Mara peeked through the gap, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The lead man, Grant Barlow, her former master, reined in his horse. His face was cruelly familiar, a grin stretched too wide, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Well, ain't this a sight?" Grant drawled. "Thought I'd lost my runaway. Didn't expect to find her playing house with a cowboy." Eli didn't reply. He leveled the rifle casually, the barrel gleaming in the sun. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. Grant laughed, the sound ugly and hollow. "I'll be taking what's mine, friend." "Step aside." Mara could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her feet refused to move. Eli's voice didn't rise, but there was steel in it. "She ain't yours." Grant's smile faded. His hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip. "You think you can keep her from me?" Eli cocked his rifle. "I don't think, Barlow." "I know." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The horses snorted, uneasy in the charged air. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a snarl, Grant drew his gun. The shot cracked through the air. Mara screamed. Flinging open the door, only to see Grant's hat fly off and Eli still standing, smoke curling from the end of his rifle. The two other men hesitated, glancing at each other, then turned their horses and bolted. Grant lay on the ground, clutching his arm, cursing through his teeth. Eli walked forward, slow and deliberate, the rifle still steady in his grip. He stopped over Grant, eyes cold as winter. "You're done hurting her," he said quietly. "You ever come near this land again, I won't aim for the arm." Grant looked up at him, fury and fear twisting his face. But he saw the truth there, the calm certainty of a man who had already buried enough ghosts. He spat into the dirt, then stumbled to his horse and rode off, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and the echo of his hate. When it was over, Eli turned back toward the porch. Mara stood there, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, she couldn't move. Then she ran to him, clutching his arm, searching for wounds. "You're bleeding," she said in a trembling voice. A bullet had grazed his shoulder. He winced, but smiled faintly. "Just a scratch." She pressed her hand over the wound, tears falling faster. "You could have died." "You didn't have to do that for me." Eli looked at her, his voice soft but steady. "Didn't do it for you. Did it 'cause it was right." The words hit her harder than any bullet could. She broke down then, not from fear, but from the release of it. For years, she'd lived under the shadow of men who saw her as nothing. Now, for the first time, someone had stood between her and the world, not to own her, but to protect her freedom. As the sun sank low behind the hills, Eli wrapped his good arm around her. The land was quiet again, save for the sound of wind in the grass. The reckoning had come and gone. And though blood had been spilled, something deeper had been restored. Her faith in herself, in goodness, in a life worth living. The next morning, the sun rose soft and gold over the ranch, gentler than it had in months. The storm had passed, the danger was gone, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier. Birds sang from the fence posts, the horses grazed in calm silence, and a faint breeze carried the smell of wild sage across the fields. But inside the house, Eli sat at the kitchen table, his arm wrapped in a clean bandage, staring out the window at the woman who now knelt by the flower bed. Mara's hands were steady as she worked, her fingers pressing seeds into the soil. Her face was turned toward the light, and for the first time she looked completely unafraid. There was no trace of the hunted woman he'd found trembling on the edge of the road weeks ago. The bruises had faded, the fear had eased, and in their place bloomed something new, quiet strength. Eli leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't a man used to peace. For years, his days had been filled with loss. His wife gone too young, his son buried under a hill marked only by a wooden cross. He had learned to survive in silence, believing his heart had nothing left to give. But Mara had changed that without trying to. She had brought warmth back into the empty spaces of his life, not through words but through presence, the kind of gentle, steady presence that healed without asking permission. When she came inside, brushing dirt from her skirt, she caught him watching her. "You should be resting," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I could say the same to you." She poured him coffee, careful not to meet his eyes at first. "You saved me," she murmured. "I don't know how to thank you." Eli shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing, Mara," but she did. Not in debt, but in gratitude. He had given her back something she thought was lost forever, her sense of worth. For years she'd believed herself broken, unwanted, too scarred to belong anywhere. Yet here, on this quiet stretch of land beneath the endless sky, she'd found something she never expected: home. Later that day, Eli took her to the north pasture where wildflowers had begun to bloom after the rain. He pointed toward the ridge, where sunlight danced off the creek. "Used to be my boy's favorite spot," he said quietly. He'd catch frogs down there. His ma would laugh every time he came back soaked. Mara stood beside him, her hand brushing his sleeve. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "Ain't your sorrow to carry. But maybe—" He paused, glancing at her. "Maybe it's time this place had laughter again." Her eyes met his, soft and full. "It already does." They stayed there for a long while, side by side, watching the clouds drift across the wide, open sky. Words weren't needed. The air between them carried all the things neither knew how to say: the gratitude, the healing, the quiet love that had grown out of pain. That evening, Mara cooked stew while Eli mended a broken gate hinge at the table. The house glowed with lamplight, the scent of bread and herbs filling the air. When she set 2 bowls before him, he looked up and said, almost shyly, "You cook better than anyone I ever met." She laughed, an easy, unguarded laugh that made him smile. "Don't let that be the only reason you keep me here," she teased. He set his spoon down, gaze steady on hers. "Ain't the reason at all." The words hung in the air, warm and unspokenly clear. Later, when the dishes were washed and the night settled deep and still, they stepped onto the porch. The stars stretched above them, bright and endless. Mara leaned against the railing, her shoulder brushing his. "Feels strange," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "to feel safe." Eli looked up at the stars, then at her. "You are safe," he said quietly. "And you're home." She turned toward him, eyes shining. "Home," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. It felt right. In that moment, surrounded by the whispering wind and the vast silence of the plains, they both understood that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding peace in what remained. Together, they had faced storms, ghosts, and fear itself. Now, at last, there was only calm and the steady promise of morning. And so, the story that began with a frightened woman whispering, "Please don't hurt me, I can work," ended with a man's quiet vow beneath the stars. "You're safe. Come home."